Hey everyone, this week we're going to be kind of introducing more systematic or and constructive thought about the Trinity. And so I'm going to do my best to make sure that these are bite-sized videos because they can be a little bit overwhelming if you get too much Trinity at once. But basically, the real problem is that Christian theology appears to be a paradox. Because Christian theology is what I think N.T. Wright calls qualified monotheism, right? Because Christians want to affirm with our Jewish friends the Shema, Yahweh is God, Yahweh is one. But at the same time, Christians also want to say that God is three. There are three persons of the Trinity. And there's a good biblical basis for this, especially at one point, Paul actually quotes the Shema, but he replaces Lord with Jesus. So he says, there's one God and one Lord, Jesus Christ, which is at least kind of Benitarian, meaning like two Tarians. Maybe not fully. Maybe that's not fully recognizing the Spirit as part of the Godhead, but it certainly seems to make Jesus ascribe to Jesus divinity. And if that's the case, then we're dealing with something that is unparalleled in human, religious, and philosophical history, because all throughout the history of the world, no one had conceived of a God that is one, as as Judaism confesses, and yet is also has like variety or multiplicity within that oneness, or constitutive of that oneness. Because in traditional theology, right, multiplicity or variegation is a sign of paganism, right? The pagans look around and there's many, many gods. And it seemed like Judaism's sort of gospel, good news to the pagan culture was that no, there's not many gods, there's one God. At the very least, even if you believe in other deities, this one God is the creator, the ruler, the king of all the gods, whatever. But there's one real, true divine being, and that divine being is one all the way through, simple, not complex. And as a result, Christian theology kind of it bursts on the scene as something in either incomprehensible and perhaps even horrific, ugly, according to especially ancient Greek norms and considerations of what the good is. So as we're moving through, we're trying to balance this question. How can we say that God is both one and three? How can we make sense of that? How can that not be just a paradox or just a contradiction, right? And so one thing that we want to just either acknowledge and put to the side at the beginning is there is a kind of naive sort of Christian theology that just says, hey, you know what? It's a paradox. It doesn't make sense. It is what it is, right? And this is paradoxical Trinitarianism. The paradoxical Trinity just says, you know what? 1 equals 3. Yeah, that's a logical contradiction, but logic is something that is restricted to our dimension, our sphere, and God is free to transcend that. That sort of thinking is not at all dominant in the tradition, and for good reason, right? Like Aquinas would say, hey, God can't make a rock so big that God can't pick it up, right? Like that's part of the rules. God can't do things that are incoherent, that don't make sense, right? God, 1 does not equal 3. That you can't even conceive of that. Like that doesn't make any sense at all. And so whatever the tradition says, there is this naive view out there, but that is largely rejected. And I say it's naive because it's probably what most Christians kind of just, it's how they operate, right? It's how we operate. We want to say, oh yeah, there's one God, but then, we say, well, Jesus did this, and the Father did that, and the Spirit does this, right? And so we speak almost out of two sides of our mouth, right? We say, God, we praise you, and then immediately we're like, Father, thank you for sending the Son. And so they're a naive, kind of unreflective, first blush kind of pass at Trinitarianism is just, hey, when we talk about the persons of the Trinity, we pretend like there's 3 gods. And when we talk about God, we say there's one. and we don't know how to fix that. It just is what it is. So that's like kind of, if you imagine the tradition, right? So the tradition starts out here, like with a kind of naive Trinitarianism. This is what your average believer might believe, but amongst theologians throughout the church, this hasn't been the case, right? And theologians throughout church history have actually kind of come down on two basic sides of the paradoxical equation, right? And so one side is the emphasis on oneness, and this is typically called Latin theology. So Latin theology tends to, and by Latin, of course, we mean the tradition that goes through the Roman Catholic Church, Western theology. And to whatever extent we don't have anyone here who's Eastern Orthodox, we probably come from this Latin tradition, whether we know it or not, broadly speaking. And again, this is it's a caricature. Like, obviously, there's plenty of people within the Latin tradition who would emphasize God's threeness, one of whom was Origen. Origen was very much, you could easily accuse Origen of tritheism. But in general, for the most part, Latin theologians tend to focus on the oneness or simplicity of God. And that's largely because Latin theologians tend to be come from a Neoplatonist background. And if you recall, when we talk about Neoplatonism tends to think of God, or the good, as simple, right? Complexity, bad; simplicity, good. Therefore, oneness better than threeness. Now, these are super broad terms. Don't assume that you know what any theologian is going to say because you know that they happen to be in the Catholic tradition rather than the Eastern Orthodox. There's a lot of variety. But in general, this is a good rule of thumb. So, Latin tradition emphasizes oneness. The other major tradition is the Eastern tradition, or the Orthodox tradition. The Eastern Orthodox tradition tends to be way less Greek, very, very much are Greek fathers, right? And they tend to be much more nuanced about thinking through the persons of the Trinity and emphasizing the economic and immanent characteristics of Father, Son, and Spirit. And so as we progress through this week's lectures, you'll note that probably our sort of hero of the week, if you want to call him that, John Zizioulas, who I think does probably the best contemporary job of balancing one and threeness in our Trinitarian thought. He actually comes from the Orthodox tradition. But for now, all we want to do is we want to say, hey, the Eastern Orthodox tradition, rule of thumb, the threeness of God. Threeness is emphasized in their theology. Now, I want to just go ahead and say, for the vast majority of both Latin and Orthodox theology, the vast majority is all Orthodox. They all believe in God being one and three, but the way that that's described, the way that that's expressed, tends to be in the Latin tradition more a focus on the oneness, and in the Orthodox tradition on the threeness. So as we go forward, I'm going to kind of share some different models, and you'll see that some of them tend to be more Latin, some of them tend to be more Orthodox, and you'll see that there's different ways of conceiving of the Godhead, and hopefully we'll come to one that hopefully balances the strengths of all the others without being clearly incoherent or paradoxical. So that's the intro for the week.